Alright, what's up everybody? Welcome back to this discussion of Tehanu. Today I'm going to cover chapters 10, 11, and 12. So chapter 10 picks up with Tanar taking refuge on the ship. And she's permitted on to avoid Handy. And it turns out that this ship is the ship from Havnor, and the person who has permitted her on is the king, Lebanon. So Tanar and the king have a lot of time to speak at the beginning of this chapter. And Tanar really comes to like and respect Lebanon. There's one scene where Tanar, the king, and a mage from Roke, Guin, are discussing some of the events that have gone on. And the Guin is talking about how on Roke, the masters came together and formed the Council of the Wise, of which Lebanon was a part. And they were discussing finding a new archmage because Ged has lost his powers. But they were also discussing finding someone on Guin. And particularly, a woman on Guin is the phrase that they use. And we also see that as they're having this conversation, that the Guin is really no different from a lot of the men of power in this story. And he makes some dismissive remarks to Tanar. And Tanar has a sarcastic response. And Guin eventually apologizes, but it's really only because he's in the king's presence. And Tanar refers to this dismissiveness on the part of Guin as like not listening to her. Like they just don't pay attention to what she's saying. And one thing we realized though is that the king does. And at least to some degree, he's very different than these older men of power. They're having a conversation and she makes a comment about ordinary fears. And in a way she does this kind of self-deprecatingly. The king responds seriously with there is too much ordinary fear. So when Lebanon makes this comment, it suggests that he's able to empathize with this idea of ordinary fear. But in order to do that, he really had to listen to understand someone else's perspective. It's also interesting to note that Tanar has this very powerful belief that the king at first was her son. He conducts himself with a nobility and a respect and a dignity that I think Tanar believes that her son will possess. So eventually Tanar debarks from this ship and there's much fanfare surrounding the king and all that. And she eventually returns with her daughter back to her homestead. And upon arriving, she learns that some of her friends and caretakers of her own homestead have sent Ged away up the mountain to herd goats in higher pastures. And this information is given so nonchalantly that Ged was just sent away to goat herd. And this is interesting because Ged was formerly a wizard. It's such a departure from the original Earthsea trilogy. He was always at the center of events. He was always involved in magic and performing heroic, legendary deeds. And now here he is, so passively sent away to go tend to goats. And so instead of being an active character, he's very much secondary. He's passive. And it's not disgraceful because, the majority of the population lives like this. But it's definitely a deflation of his former status and stature. So in chapter 10, titled Home, Tanar is still trying to figure out what to do with Theru. And, she talks to Ivy and she talks to Beach. And Beach is a very charismatic, friendly, and amicable wizard. And, they're having a conversation when he's passing by her homestead. And he's very much congratulating Tanar on her ability to raise Theru and take care of her. And there's this strange moment. Tanar makes a comment about what to do with Theru, and she makes this remark of Ogien's and how he had said not Roke when referring to training Theru. And Beach, once he hears Ogien's words, he confidently interprets this for Theru. And he basically says that, what Ogien means is that Theru, because she's a woman, that it's not suitable for Theru to learn the high arts of Roke. And that Roke is only meant for boys. And it's obvious that Tanar bristles at this. And we see that Beach, just like Winky earlier, though they are good by nature and likely very righteous people, still have certain views about the roles of women and what power they're allowed. So in chapter 11, this chapter titled Home, these drifters who had assaulted Theru earlier, attack Tanar's house. It's a tense scene, and Tanar is caught off guard, unprepared, unguarded, and running around the house trying to figure out what to do, trying to lock the windows to prevent them from breaking in. And as a defiant last stand, she opens the door and is holding a butcher knife. Turns out Ged has shown up, and he just impales one of these drifters with a pitchfork. So we do see that even though Ged is without his wizardry, he is very much still in possession of the qualities that made him a hero. And this was a tense scene. I will say, I wish it would have unfolded in real time from the characters' perspectives rather than being, recited back by Ged. And after the fact, Tanar is blaming herself about what she should have done. But interestingly, I think Ged also understands this point very well. It's an ordinary fear, and it's an ordinary worry. Like, what should they have done? Ged even kind of suggests that he kind of got lucky in a lot of ways. This chapter, this scene, is specifically what started to just completely transform the mood and the tone and the atmosphere of this story. Because here we have a very dangerous event with people being attacked, and Ged is involved in it, but he's without wizardry. And there's no anti-moss, so there's no magic, there's no dragon. It didn't feel like it was a scene in a fantasy book. And this scene really started the transformation for me of magic being secondary. The story itself sort of transforms from being a fantasy almost into a pastoral drama or thriller, but made strange by the fact that there are fantasy elements. It just completely upended my expectations in a very good way. There's something very humble in when Ged later expresses how easily he could have overpowered all of these men, all of these drifters, if he still had his wizardry. And I think that this is a lesson that Tanar had wanted Ged to learn. She had sort of, in her mind, mocked him because he didn't understand this concept, and here he has learned it, right? There are lessons to learn in ordinary fear. And if you're a person of power, it's easy to overlook and lack empathy for those who do suffer from these fears. And in the next chapter, in the chapter entitled Winter, we see that Ged and Tanar are very clearly passionate about one another, and so they begin a romance. And although I had suspected that Tanar had feelings for Ged earlier, it was one of those scenes where I just didn't expect the romance to be committed to. And I'll be honest, in another book, this romance could have come across as very quick and maybe even a bit silly and rushed. And Tanar makes some silly comments about this relationship. In this book, it just came across as so transformative, because it really grounded the story in the pastoral, the farm life. And it felt distant from the magic from Earthsea, but even from the first half of this book. Magic has sort of become secondary in these last few chapters. So the mood changed, the atmosphere changed. I just didn't expect to start thinking of the characters in that way. In a way that's just far removed from wizardry, far removed from legendary events. And in some way, this is where the book went from good to great for me, just because I didn't expect or anticipate any of this. However, I could see if you were reading this and you wanted fantasy and expected fantasy, how this book could have went from good to bad for some people. Because it just doesn't have some of the elements that I was expecting it to have. And so I think for me, it just subverted so many expected themes and then delivered them in a whole new package with a whole new feeling and an atmosphere and mood. But I think it's important in this equation to have read the earlier books. It's important to know who Ged was, to know how important and powerful he was. It's also important to know who Tanar was. And I think without those initial conditions, this book might not land or resonate as well with the reader because some of the subversion of the themes and the expectations might not feel as important or significant. This book went from a world of magic populated by wizards who involve themselves in heroic legendary quests to a very mundane, ordinary life of romance and drama where the protagonists suffer from ordinary fears. And that fear and that danger is not suffered from some large heroic reason. It's just to survive. It's to barely hold on to survival and also to protect those around them. That's why they suffer it. Right? In some way, it went from an epic fantasy to a mundane, ordinary, pastoral drama with some thriller elements. It felt to me more Steinbeck than Tolkien. And this is all my opinion. But this book had such a transformation that it underwent in these last few chapters. And it just gave me the impression suddenly that so much had happened. Because the themes and the mood and the atmosphere had changed so much, it felt like it was so long ago when Tanar had a conversation with the dragon. It felt like so much had occurred. And that was just another aspect of this book that was so cool and so fun to read. So yeah, as always, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I'll see you on the next video and have a good one. Peace.